Hello and welcome to yet another episode of me reacting to fan-made cards I found on the internet. And in today's episode, I first want to go over one specific card made by Demsu. As always, you can find links to all of the Reddit posts where I found these cards in the description, so definitely check them out and leave them an upvote. I really appreciate all the people that are making fan-made cards on the subreddit or on BGG or wherever I find those. But yeah, this first card here is Floating City. And I thought this would be an interesting one to start off with, because it has a slightly new mechanic that is a bit rule breaking, and we should discuss this. But first, let's go over the specifics here. So Floating City costs 24, requires 2 oceans, which makes sense thematically. Has a science tag, a building tag, and a city tag. And the science tag, I guess, is because the city needs to be built on water, and that's kind of difficult to do. So that's why you only need a lot of science for that. Grants you a point, that's okay, but not groundbreaking. Grants you power, which is nice. I guess you have some like hydro turbines on in that city, and 2 money prod. So that differentiates it from other city cards like Cupola City or Noctis City that cost you power prod. This one gives you power prod, and it's kind of similar to Field Kept City, which is also really expensive, same as this one, but grants you power prod instead of costing one. But the interesting thing about this card comes down here. It says that you need to place a tile on an area reserved for ocean or for oceans. And this is actually something that this card shouldn't say, because there are 12 areas reserved for oceans, and there are 9 oceans. So normally there are like 3 spots left over at the end of the game. And coincidentally, in the base game, there are 3 tiles that can be placed on ocean reserved areas, which are Mohole area, Mangrove, and Protected Valley. And if all of these cards are played and someone plays Floating City, then not all oceans can be placed, and the game can't end. And that's rule breaking, that's game breaking. So this requirement shouldn't say that it needs to be placed on an area reserved for ocean. And of course, I'm not the first one pointing that out. In the Reddit posts, people talked about that already, because it's really easy to spot immediately. And they suggested a tweak to the card, which I also think is really, really nice. And it states that you need to place the city on an ocean, so on top of an already placed ocean, not removing that ocean, so it still works towards the game ending. But it still makes sense thematically or lore-wise in that regard. And I think that's really, really nice, because that's a mechanic that we don't have in the game yet, placing a tile on top of another tile. I think that's an idea that other fan-made expansions have already made or had, but I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think the high price would be kind of well worth it, because in the early game, what a lot of players do is ocean walking. So they place greeneries next to oceans and get rebates, because if you place the greenery next to 2 oceans, for example, you not only get the placement bonus of that tile, which often is plants next to oceans, and plants are really good because you can place more greeneries then, but you also get the ocean rebate. So ocean walking is really powerful in the early game because you get a lot of money back. So you often have this situation where oceans always have a lot of greeneries around them. And placing then in the late game Floating City on an ocean spot and gaining all of the points from the greeneries around it is just really good. And it's also like a spot that can't be blocked. So if you draw this in the mid to late game, you just know that's 4 points, or in this case, 4 or 5 points, or even more, because it still gives you a point, and that nobody can deny you. That spot can't be blocked. Of course, I say it can't be blocked, but it isn't really like a reserved area, so it could still be the case that there's a city nearby and you cannot place your city there, because the normal city placement rules still apply. But you will surely find a spot where you can place this and profit off of a lot of greeneries around these oceans. And then, of course, I always love the late game building tags that grant a lot of points, because I feel like in the base game and the expansions there are too few building tags for the late game that grant a lot of points. Of course, it's still really expensive, and part of that is because it grants a power prod and grants 2MC prod, which, if you only use this for scoring a lot of points in the late game, is pretty unnecessary. You probably won't need power prod or MC prod in the late game, and this card is just too expensive to play in the early to mid game. But I think even then, just because it's building tech and it can grant a lot of points, I think this card is pretty good. Of course, not in this version, but if slightly tweaked. But yeah, let's get to the next set of cards from a different creator. And yeah, these next few cards are all made by Star Trek 238. He's a creator on Reddit that has already made quite a few cards that I've covered in earlier episodes of fan-made cards. And he always has really creative ideas, so definitely check out his profile. I've linked the posts I've gotten these cards from in the description, as I said. And the first one here is, again, one that I really like. It's called Aerial Pollination. Costs 6 MC, so it's a cheap plant tag, which is always nice for like insects or NRA, but at least for NRA, it comes down quite late with 5% oxygen. For insects, of course, it's perfect because insects are 6%. And it has an ongoing effect that when you place a greenery tile to adjacent to another greenery tile, you gain 1 plant. Now, I don't know if this can be triggered multiple times by the same greenery, but I would think so. So if you place a greenery next to 2 other greeneries, you get 2 plants, or next to 3 other greeneries, you get 3 plants. So that's how I think this works. And if it's like that, then this is insanely strong. Because ocean walking, as I said, and placing a lot of greeneries in the early to mid game is already one of the strongest strategies if you can pull it off with cards like Towing a Comet, Arctic Algae, and then just early cheap plant producers like Archaebacteria, Lichen, and nitrophilic moss. Like, getting a lot of greeneries down in the early game is really strong. And aerial pollination, if you've already gotten a few greeneries down, then you can play this, and it makes it even stronger. I think this is a really strong card, and I think to balance this, and maybe it's even meant like that, but it's not that clear. It should work like you only get 1 plant no matter how many greeneries you're placing that greenery next to. So then I think this would still be a really strong card because it's cheap plant tag that grants you a lot of plants over the course of a game, but it's definitely more balanced that way. But let's get, and again, I think this card is just thematically and lore-wise made so well. It makes complete sense. It's an effect that makes sense with the lore behind it. It's just a great card. Like, this could easily be in an expansion. This is not recognizable as a fan-made card, in my opinion. It's perfect. But let's get to the next one. And this one is also really interesting. Biodome. Also costs 6 MC as a building and animal tag, so 2 really useful tags. I think there's only like Martian Zoo and maybe what's the other, Meat Industries? Does Meat Industries have these tags? I'll put it on screen right now and you can see it for yourself. But it's a combination of tags that you don't see that often. Useful tags, of course. You can only play it until a maximum of 7% oxygen. And that's important for the effect, because it grants 1 point, which is okay as it's relatively cheap card. If you have a lot of zeal in the early to mid game, you can definitely just play this for this 1 point. Like a corporation like mining will maybe just have so much zeal that you just play this for this 1 point. This card starts off with 2 animals on it, and then it has an action that allows you to remove animals from this card and put it on other cards. The animals on this card do not do anything for you, So the only reason they are there is to get used up to be placed on other cards. And opponents may not remove the animals on this card with stuff like virus or predators. So you basically have to play this in the early to mid game because 7% oxygen, and later you want to use it to put the animals on a 1-point animal that you can only play in the late game, something like birds, fish, livestock. Of course, if you already have a 1-point animal on hand, like birds, fish, livestock, then this is a no-brainer because you can just play it right before you get to 7% oxygen. You chill with these animals on them, and then in the late game, when you get the other animal down, you remove these animals, put them on the other card. Of course, you need 2 gens for it. So if you have, like, for example, birds on hand, and you play that in the last gen, then you get only 1 animal from this card on birds. But it's quite rare that you play your only other animal in the last gen. Often you have it at least 1 gen beforehand. So you need to try to make sure to get that down. Otherwise, it was just a relatively cheap point, so I think it's not the end of the world. What you can also do with this card is you can fly to Miranda, get animals of this colony, profit maybe off of the colony bonus, so draw cards from it, and put the animals on Biodome. And then you can, in the mid game, already start moving animals from here to other cards, like small animals, and then later switch to 1-point animals. But of course, you shouldn't overdo it, because if you end up with like 5 animals on Biodome, that they don't do anything for you other than maybe when you're eccentric. But let's get to the next one. Cold Power, really simple card, but I think it's a cool design because it has pros and cons, and I think it's pretty balanced. It's really cheap. It's similar to Peroxide Power, Nuke Power, and the other one that I just cannot remember. Fuel Generators, yeah, that grants Power Prod for the expense of MC Prod. But instead of costing MC Prod and only granting you Power Prod, you also get Heat Prod, and it has a global requirement, meaning you cannot play this in the early game. And this makes this card significantly weaker because half of its effect is Heat Prod, and Heat Prod in the mid game isn't that great. Power Prod in the mid game can still be quite useful to play power hungry cards, especially city cards, for example, that you want to place next to your greeneries and stuff. But Heat Prod in the mid game, I mean, if the oxygen rushes up early because of someone that played, like, for example, Arctic Algae or so, and the Heat Prod can still be useful, but often this isn't that strong. But in exchange for that, this card is really cheap. I mean, if you think about it, fuel generators cost just 1 less, but this card, Cold Power, gives you a Heat Prod in addition to what fuel generators grants you. So I like this card. It has pros and cons. I think it's well balanced. Maybe a bit on the weaker side because of this requirement, but it's good. Then next up we have a card that can make you feel similar to Mining Guild, because Geological Surveying basically grants you half of Mining Guild's effect. Cost 7, grants you building tech, and whenever you place a tile on an area that grants either steel or titanium as a placement bonus, you either add a resource on this card or you remove a resource and get a steel pot. And just getting a steel pot from placing tiles on these areas is what Mining Guild does for you. And because this card starts with a data resource on this card already, this means the first tile that you place after playing Geological Surveying will already give you a steel pot. I think this card is quite weak. I know there are a lot of fan-made expansions that use this data resource, so maybe if you have other cards that work together with this, this Geological Surveying can be better. But the problem is, how many tiles will you place early on areas that grant these resources? Not that many. With Mining Guild, you only pick that corp if you have 1, 2, or 3 tiles on your starting hand, and then you often place those in suboptimal areas just to get Mining Guild's bonus. But with this card, you only get half of Mining Guild's bonus, And do you then really want to place your tiles in suboptimal areas, especially city tiles? Think about castles. There's maybe one area, like on the equator on the west, where you get the titanium and the plant, that is a good city spot. That grants you a steel or titanium as a placement bonus. All the other city spots or good city spots are just plant placement bonuses. Of course, you can place it up north on the volcanic area or down south on the steel spots, but those are not great as city spots, and you would rather only place your special tiles here. So, and then in the mid to late game, this doesn't do really that much for you, because you don't profit off of your steel plot that much anymore. So if you get this down Gen 1, it can maybe grant you 2, because you only need 3 tiles on these areas with a 2 steel plot, but I don't think it will grant you much more than that, and I don't know if it's worth it for that. So I think this is quite weak. If this costs like 4 MC, then I think about it, because then it's really cheap. And you can get like at least one really easy steel plot out of it. 4 is maybe too cheap, because then you could, it's just a better mine if you have a tile to immediately follow it up, because it's basically the same as mine, but can grant you more steel plot. So maybe 5. But yeah, maybe just cut the building tag and make it 4 or 3, because the building tag I think also doesn't make that much sense. But yeah, I don't think this card is so strong. But let's get to the next one. This again is a really, really creative one that I really like. GHD from animals, costs 5, needs or requires an animal tag, because yeah, it's GHD from animals, and it grants me 2 heat prod. So it's really cheap for 2 heat prod compared to imported advanced GHG, which costs 4 more. The problem is you need an animal tag. Animal tags are hard to come by in the early game. Like most animal cards have high requirements. Of course, there are exceptions, like the Biodome we saw before, or pets in the base game, and of course there are wild tags. So if you can get this down like really early on, Gen 1 or 2, then it's an incredibly good card, because it grants you 2 cheap heat prod. But often you will not find an animal tag, and this card is just worthless then, because it has no tag, it has no points, and heat prod in the mid to late game isn't that great. But yeah, thematically again, this is insanely good, because yeah, animals, especially cows, produce GHG, and yeah, we could use this to heat up the plant. But what I don't really get is, I mean, they poop out the GHG anyways. Why do we need to collect it with stuff like that? But I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but I think the concept is still really nice. But yeah, not that much to talk about, so let's get to the next one, which is helium-3 mining. Costs 15, has an earth tag and a power tag, grants 2 power prod and 2 titanium. So basically it costs only 9 if you have an immediate use for the titanium. And then it's cheaper than geothermal power, which also grants you 2 power prod. But of course, geothermal power has a building tag instead of an earth tag, which makes it considerably easier to play, because you can use steel for it. But earth tags, of course, also have upsides for stuff like Cartel, Point Luna, and Director, and so on. So I think this is just... I think it's fairly priced. It's a bit harder to get down, which I think is more important than the combo potential from this earth tag. And you need to have space tags to play immediately afterwards to make it really only cost 9. And even then, it's harder to get down immediately, because it costs 15. So I think it's fairly priced. And if you can make use of this titanium, then I think it's a really good power production card. But yeah, again, not that much to talk about it. I think pretty good card. This again is a really interesting one, Hunting Expedition. And I think this would induce so much rage, because what it does is it costs 1 MC as an event, so cheap event can be really useful for IC or media group. It grants you 4 MC for killing 3 of your opponent's animals. And it also has -1 point because you don't want to hunt, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's basically the same point differential as with virus for the same cost. Lacks microbe tag, but grants you 4 MC. So I think it's also, of course, less flexible than virus. So I think it's not broken. But for especially like in a 3-player game, the player that is not hit by this and also doesn't play it will feel so great because one player just got -1 point and the other player got a maximum of -3 points. So in a 2-player game, of course, this is the same as virus and will induce a lot of rage. In a 3-player game, the third wheeler basically will feel really good about this. I like this conceptually again because you hunt animals, you sell them, but it's also not good for like making Mars habitable and just ethically. So I like this thematically and I think it's a cool card. And I would love to hit my friends with this and see them rage. Next up, we have hydroponic farming. Cool concept. And it's similar to a few cards we already have in game. So it has the same tags as Biodome. No, not Biodome. Dome farming. Biodome was the other card we saw before. Dome farming, prelude, that also has a plant tag, a building tag, and also grants 2 MC prot and 1 plant prot. So that's an okay combo, and really, dome farming is really cool for getting copied with robotic workflow. Not that much with this card, because this card also costs you a power prot. In exchange for that, you also get an instant plant. I like cards that come with a building tag and a plant tag, because it can make these cards really easy to play. A card like Noctis Farming, for example, can be really easy to play if you have accumulated some steel prot in the early game. And the plant tag then can be really nice for the green combos. So you can kind of combine 2 different strategies. But I don't think this card is that strong because it's quite expensive. 13 and then this power prot costs like 7 MC or 8 MC on average. So already 20 or 21 plus the cost to buy. And then you get only 1 plant prot out of this, which is, I think, the most important part of this card. The 2 MC prot makes this card cheaper over time, basically. So the earlier you play it, the better. But I don't know if this card is that strong. If you start the game off with a lot of money and you have power prot left over, which both of those together don't happen that much, then I think this is quite a good card to play, especially if you are in need of a plant tag. But in other scenarios, where you just randomly draw this, I don't think it's that great. The penultimate card is Micro Culturing Lab. And I think this one is a really good one and probably a bit too strong. Not because of the action, but because of its cheap cost and 3 tags. Just think of Aerodor playing this. It's a 4-cost card that comes with 3 tags that immediately grant you 3 MC prot, and even for all other corps. If there's Diversifier in the game or Ecologist, it also helps on Tharsis by a lot for Builder and Scientist. So these 3 tags can be really, really nice. And then also it has an action that allows you to spend 1 energy to add a microbe to another card. These easy actions can be really nice just for stalling purposes. And B, adding microbes to other cards is kind of underrated. There are like not that many great microbe cards in the base game, but there are a few. Like Tardigrades is okay if you play it early. Decomposers is quite nice. GHG producing bacteria can be cool. And then in the expansions, of course, there are some absolutely busted microbe cards. Sacrifice is really strong. Sulfur eating bacteria is really good. So this can be really, really nice. Of course, spending 1 energy for a microbe I'm not sure how much value you gain out of this, especially if you spend 1 energy to add a microbe on tardigrades, because 1 energy in my mind is worth more than a quarter of a point, because if you have no use for the energy, it converts to heat, and then you can use it for TR bumps. But let's say you're in a science strategy, which is highly likely if you're, not highly likely, but which could be very well be the case if you're playing microbe culture in lab with the science tech, then this is an insanely good card, because if you get like quantum or mass converter down, you will have a lot of leftover energy, and you don't necessarily want to increase the heat because you will probably profit off of long game. And then using microbe culturing like is really, really good. It helps you stall out the opponent, it gives you useful tags, and you can use your enormous amount of power to just get points. But yeah, of course, you need a good microbe card to make use of this. But let's get to the last card of today's video, which is vertical integration. Again, another really interesting concept. Costs 1 MC, has an earth tag. You need to spend 1 of each standard resource, and then you get 4 MC prot. So I just would like this card to have a cost of 0 MC, so you really only spend 1 of each standard resource, because then this would make me happy. But I think this card is interesting, but not that strong. It's kind of hard in the early game to get every standard resource, especially in Gen 1. It's nearly impossible to get every standard resource if you're not menu tech with an insanely lucky start. And then you need to get a lot of production cards down and a bit of luck to get all standard resources in Gen 2. And this card, of course, loses in value the later you play it. How much does this card cost? Like, buying it for 3 plus this, that's 4, 5, 7, 10. 10 for just the resources that can be used to pay for stuff. And then, in addition to that, the plant, the power, and the heat. I'm not sure about the prices for those, if you like compare this to MC. But in my mind, plants, power, and heat are all worth more than MC. So this card isn't that cheap. I'd like to have this cost cut down to 0, and then I think it would be a situational card, but if you find it in the right scenario, it can be quite strong. But if you have to fight for these resources just to play this card, then I don't think it's worth it. But yeah, again, please check out the description where I've linked all of the Reddit posts I found these cards at. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.